The Apache girl was left to die in a pit, but one man climbed down and never came back up alone. The canyon was a wound in the earth, deep, dry, and forgotten by all but the wind. It sliced through the northern edge of the Arizona territory like a jagged scar, its ochre walls steep and unyielding, carved not just by time, but by violence, by storm, by collapse. Beneath the sun's relentless glare, the land shimmered in stillness, the heat rising in visible waves from the cracked stone, the air thick with dust and silence. Ravens circled lazily overhead, their shadows gliding over the rock like spirits with no destination. And at the very bottom of that pit, in a hollow shaped by centuries of erosion and indifference, lay the body of a girl. She was Apache, young, barely more than a whisper of a woman. Her name, unknown to those who had thrown her down, was Nasha, owl in the language of her people, a name meant for those who saw what others could not. But here, in the belly of this earthen grave, no one could see her at all. The fall had broken her shoulder and cracked 2 ribs. The descent had torn her skin and bloodied her knees, but it had not taken her spirit. Around her, silence pulsed like a second heart. Not even the insects ventured into that deep well of heat and shadow. The pit was 20 feet deep, its walls sheer and jagged. It was not a proper prison, not a sanctioned cell. It was worse. It was a secret place. A place for those whom justice would not trouble itself to kill openly. A place meant for things that were meant to be forgotten. The men who had brought her here had not spoken her name. They had bound her wrists, dragged her behind their horses across shale and thorn, and said only this before kicking dust into her face. The coyotes'll finish what the courts couldn't. They laughed as they rode away, their shadows swallowed by the canyon rim, their cruelty left behind like discarded boots. She had not screamed when they dropped her. She had not begged. Only silence met their retreat, a silence heavier than any curse. For 2 days, Nasha had drifted in and out of consciousness. The heat was a merciless god, beating down from above with no shade, no water. Her lips had cracked, her tongue thickened in her mouth. Her skin blistered and peeled, but her eyes, those wide, dark eyes, remained open, always open, watching the light shift across the walls, listening to the whispers of the wind that slid down into the pit like ghostly fingers, smelling the dust, the blood, the echo of horses long gone. She did not pray for rescue, not because she had no faith, but because she had lived long enough to know the land gave nothing for free. The desert was not cruel. It was merely honest. It had no use for false hope. Still, she waited, not for salvation, but for clarity. A vision, maybe. A message in the stones. Her grandmother had once told her that when the body breaks, the spirit walks, and when it walks far enough, it finds truth. It was on the 3rd day that the vision came, not as a dream, but as sound. A boot scraped against stone. Then another. And then, slowly, like thunder drawn across bone, a man's voice, low, uneven, cautious, but real. "Anyone down there?" Nasha blinked against the sunlight that cut across the rim above her like a blade. She tried to lift her head, but her neck refused. Dust fell from the canyon wall as someone shifted near the edge. A face appeared, weathered, tanned, eyes the color of burnt whiskey, squinting beneath a hat stained with sweat and time. He looked down at her not with pity, not with shock, but with something harder to name. A kind of reverence, as though he'd found not a dying girl, but a relic, a sacred thing the land had hidden and only now revealed. "I'm coming down," he said. She wanted to speak, to tell him not to bother, that it was too late, that the heat and the stone had already taken her bones into their keeping. But her voice was gone. Only her eyes remained, dark and unyielding, defiant even now. The man tied a rope to the saddle of his horse, tested its weight, and began to descend, slowly, carefully. His boots found the narrow footholds as though guided by instinct or fate. As he drew closer, the air seemed to shift, cooler suddenly, though the sun still blazed above. He dropped beside her with a grunt. She smelled sweat, leather, tobacco. He knelt beside her and did not speak, only looked for a long time. And then he reached out, not to bind, not to hurt, not to examine, but to lift her gently into his arms, like one lifts a broken bird. "I ain't leaving you down here," he murmured. And he didn't, not ever again. The canyon wall loomed above them, a jagged mouth with no tongue, no mercy. From the bottom, it seemed impossibly steep, its sandstone ridges sharp and shifting, its loose shale eager to betray even the surest step. But the man did not hesitate. His hands, thick with callus and cracked from years of saddle and rope, wrapped around the Apache girl's broken body with a gentleness that did not belong in a place like this. He adjusted her weight against his chest, careful of her injuries, then turned his eyes upward, toward the light, the rim, the horse waiting above with the rope taut and silent. Her body felt like smoke in his arms, feather-light and unmoored, but the heat that radiated off her skin was fierce. A fever had begun its slow burn in her, her cracked lips murmuring syllables too faint to catch. Her eyes fluttered once, not in fear, but in disbelief, as if she could not fathom that someone had come, not a spirit, not a hallucination, but a man of flesh and sweat and breath. She watched him in fragments, his jaw clenched in silent resolve, his shirt soaked and clinging to his ribs. She did not know his name. He had not offered it. And yet there was no hesitation in the way he lifted her, no doubt in the way he bore her weight, as if it were a duty sealed in the marrow of his bones. The rope stretched up into the sunlight like a lifeline drawn by angels. He glanced at it, calculated the angle, then pulled it gently with one hand to test its hold. The knot held fast. His horse, a stocky Mustang the color of dusk, stood motionless at the rim, trained well, its ears twitching at the faint groan of leather against stone. The man wrapped the girl's arms carefully around his neck, then positioned himself beneath the rope. With one hand, he braced her weight. With the other, he began the climb. Each foothold was a promise whispered and then broken. Pebbles dislodged beneath his boots, falling into the pit below like dropped memories. Sweat poured down his face, tracing rivers through the dust. His breath came heavy, each exhale a curse against the sun, the rock, the cruelty of men who would use the earth itself as a grave. Above, the desert wind shifted, and the first raven called, a low, echoing croak that seemed to roll down the canyon walls like a warning. The man did not look up. He focused only on the next ledge, the next grip, the next chance to survive. And all the while, the girl clung to his back, her consciousness fading in and out, her breath hot against his neck. Once, her fingers twitched. Once, she whispered something in Apache, words he did not understand, but which filled the air with ancient weight, as if she called not to him, but to the canyon itself, asking it to spare him. Halfway up, his strength began to falter. The sun burned overhead. His arms ached. His legs shook. A slip here, a misstep there, and both of them would return to the bottom, not as flesh, but as bone. He paused on a narrow ledge, his chest heaving, his vision blurred by salt and dust. He glanced back down into the pit, not in fear, but in defiance. He would not leave her there, not for the snakes, not for the sun, not for the silence. He climbed again, fingers bleeding now, nails split from the jagged edges of stone. His boots found fragile holds, the rope swaying with each movement, every inch an argument between death and devotion. The top grew closer, the sky wider. The horse waited still, its hooves steady, as though it understood what hung from its weight. When the man finally crested the rim, he did not cry out. He did not cheer. He collapsed onto his back, with the girl still wrapped against him, their combined dust painting the ground in the shape of some new thing, neither Apache nor settler, neither prisoner nor rescuer, but something sacred, something reborn in the heat and silence. The wind picked up, brushing over them like a blessing. She stirred in his arms, her voice no louder than the wind itself. "Why?" she asked. It was the only word she could manage. The man looked down at her, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. His voice was low, gravel thick. "'Cause you don't belong in a hole," he said, "and I reckon neither do I." And with that, he lifted her again. This time, not as a stranger carrying a burden, but as something else, something deeper, something fated. He turned toward the horizon, where the sun began its descent into blood-red streaks and long shadows. And he walked, not away from the pit, but toward something new. They reached the edge of the town by nightfall. It lay crouched beneath a ring of hills like something coiled and waiting, its lights flickering weakly through the dust as the wind rolled across the dry flats. A rail line sliced its edge like a wound that never closed, and beyond it, clusters of crooked homes leaned into one another like conspirators. No one called this place beautiful. No one sang songs about it. But it endured, like a scar, like a nail hammered too deep to pull free. The man's name, when it was finally asked of him, was Elijah Cormack. He was known around those parts, though not well. A former cavalry scout turned drifter, he had worn the badge for one short, bitter year before giving it up in a blur of whiskey and something darker. Folks whispered about his past in the corners of saloons, about a woman in New Mexico, about a brother killed in a border skirmish, about a night in Dodge when he walked into a storm of bullets and came out the other side quieter than he went in. But they never spoke those stories aloud when he was near. He carried silence, like other men carried rifles. And now, riding into town with an Apache girl cradled in front of him, he brought that silence with him again. Except now it wore a shape that made folks rise from their porches and narrow their eyes. Nasha was wrapped in a blanket he'd taken from his saddle roll, her wounds hidden, her fever burning. Her head rested against Elijah's chest, and though she did not speak, her eyes were open, scanning the town that had already tried to bury her. The signs were all there, boarded windows, rusted locks, saloons that went quiet as soon as he passed. A woman yanked her child off the street with a sharp motion. A dog barked once and then fell silent. The town knew who she was, or at least what she was. He rode straight to the livery, dismounted, lifted her gently into his arms. The stable hand, a boy no older than 16, stepped back the moment he saw her. "Mr. Cormack," he stammered, you can't bring her here." Elijah said nothing, just looked at him. The boy swallowed hard. "You know what they'll say, what the marshal will say. She's the one they threw down Snake Pit Canyon." Elijah's voice was soft, deadly calm. "She's the one they left to die." The boy didn't answer, just stepped aside. From there, Elijah carried Nasha to the back of the stables, into a small hayloft room where he sometimes slept when coin was tight. He laid her down on a blanket, fetched water, tore strips from his own shirt to bind the worst of her wounds. Through it all, she didn't flinch, didn't speak, only watched him with those eyes, black as obsidian, ancient as the rock she'd nearly died beneath. Word spread fast. By morning, the town was a kettle over flame. Men gathered outside the saloon, voices low, hands on their belts. Sheriff Malden, a thick man with sunburnt skin and a belly hardened by whiskey and lawless years, rode up to the livery before the sun had finished climbing the hills. He dismounted with a grunt, looked around, spat into the dust. He didn't knock, just pushed open the stable door and called up into the loft. "Cormack, you got a death wish?" Elijah's boots creaked above. Then he appeared at the edge of the loft, one hand resting loosely on the rail, the other not far from the revolver at his hip. "I got a girl," he said, "one they left to rot." "She was tried," Malden said. "Didn't hang, so they dropped her. Simple justice." "She never stood trial," Elijah said. "She was kidnapped and dumped like garbage." "She was Apache." The words hung heavy, as if they explained everything. Elijah came down the ladder slow, measured. His eyes never left the sheriff's. "She was a girl, alone, half dead, and you'll not touch her now." Malden smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Town won't stand for this. They see her here. They remember the raids, the fires, the blood. They don't care if she did it or not. They see one of them." "I ain't asking what the town sees." Elijah's voice was flint on steel. "I'm telling you what she is now, mine to protect. The sheriff tilted his head. "You gonna take on the whole damn town?" Elijah looked back toward the loft, toward the girl whose life now hung between their silences. "If I have to." And in that moment, something shifted, not in the sheriff, not in Elijah, but in the wind outside, which picked up a note of warning, in the sky, which clouded sudden and fast, as though the earth itself remembered who she was, and who had climbed down to carry her back. The fever came like a thief in the dark, quiet at first, no more than a flush on her cheeks and a tremble in her limbs. But by nightfall, it had bloomed into a wildfire that raged beneath her skin. Nasha tossed beneath the blanket, her breath short and ragged, her eyes glassy and unfocused. Words in Apache spilled from her lips in half-formed fragments, stories twisted by fever and pain. Names, prayers, warnings. Her mind wandered the desert, even as her body lay trapped in the hayloft, too weak to fight, too strong to surrender. Elijah stayed by her side, arms folded across his knees, jaw clenched tight. He soaked a rag in cool water and laid it across her brow again and again, watching the sweat bead and run down her temples like dew from cactus flesh. The scent of her illness, sharp, earthy, laced with blood, filled the small loft like incense from some ancient ritual. Outside, the wind had turned dry and hot, whispering through the cracks in the wood, like a voice mourning something already lost. He had seen men die from fever before, soldiers in canvas tents, their bodies writhing until they grew still. He knew the signs, knew the pacing of death when it wore fire as a mask. But this time, it felt different. Not just because she was young, not just because she was a woman, but because something in her refused to be claimed. Even as her body convulsed, her spirit burned with its own strange, silent heat. A flame that did not beg, did not cry, only endured. He sat beside her through the second night. The town stirred below, restless. Voices rose and fell on the wind, angry, nervous, impatient. He heard someone shout his name, then a bottle shatter on dirt. The sheriff hadn't come back yet, but it was only a matter of time. Every hour she remained alive was a challenge to the story the town had already told itself. A story in which she was a villain, a savage, a ghost that needed to be buried deep. Elijah poured water between her lips, drop by drop. She coughed once, twice, then lay still. "Stay with me," he whispered. He didn't know if she heard him. He didn't know if it mattered. But the third night came like a test. The fever peaked, hot enough to blister. She thrashed in the blankets, her limbs too weak to resist, her voice rising in a cry that tore through the loft like a torn drum. She spoke to someone who wasn't there, an old woman, maybe her grandmother. She spoke of deer, of smoke, of a red moon that bled over the mountains. Elijah didn't understand the words, but he understood the pain. And then, just before dawn, the fire broke. It didn't die so much as retreat, slowly, reluctantly, like a predator backing into the shadows. Her body went limp, her breathing slowed. For a terrible moment, he thought she was gone. But her eyes opened. Clear, dark, focused. She looked at him, really looked, and in that gaze there was no confusion, no fear, only recognition, as if she had walked the other side of death and returned with his name on her lips. "Elijah," she whispered. It was the first time she had spoken it. He didn't ask how she knew it. Maybe she had heard it through fevered dreams. Maybe the wind had carried it to her, or maybe she had known it all along. He reached for her hand. "I'm here," he said. And for a moment, the world outside vanished. No town, no sheriff, no gallows waiting in the corners of angry minds. Only this room, this breath, this heartbeat. She slept then, deep and still, and he watched her as the sky turned soft with morning. But peace was a fragile thing, and it would not last long, because at that very moment, down in the main street, a fire had been lit, not in any hearth, but in the hearts of men. A fire of fear, a fire of hate, and it was coming for them both. The fire began in whispers, Men gathered in tight circles behind shuttered saloons and dry goods stores, their voices thick with dust and whiskey, their eyes clouded with fear masquerading as righteousness. By noon, the sheriff had returned, not with warrants, but with words. Words like justice and order and men do what they have to. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The town was already listening. Elijah saw it unfolding from the loft window. 3 men on horseback riding slow up Main Street, rifles across their saddles, expressions carved from old resentment. One of them was Tom Darby, whose brother had died in a raid 5 years back. Another was Owen Pike, who claimed he'd once been shot at by an Apache boy while tending fence. The third was Whit Kinsey, who didn't need a reason. Some men carried hate the way others carried coins, close, constant, and always at the ready. They called it a gathering, not a posse, said they just wanted to talk, said no one wanted trouble. But Elijah had seen how mobs were born. They started with talk. Then came torches. Then came blood. In the loft, Naisha stirred. She had slept the fever off, but her strength was slow to return. She sat propped against a wall, wrapped in the same blanket he'd carried her out with, her hair a tangled cascade around her bruised face. When she heard the hoofbeats, her body stiffened, not from fear, but from memory. "They come," she said. Elijah nodded. "I know." She looked at him then, with that same quiet fire he had seen the day he climbed down into the pit. "You don't have to stay." "I didn't climb down to climb back out alone." She held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded once, solemn as a prayer. He loaded his rifle in silence. 6 rounds, that was all. The first man to knock on the stable door was Darby. "Elijah," he called, "ain't looking to spill blood." Elijah opened the door a crack. The sun outside was blinding. Dust hung thick in the air. "Then turn around," he said. "We can't do that." "Why not?" "Because we remember. We remember what they done, what she is." "She didn't do it." "Doesn't matter." That was the truth of it. It had never been about guilt. It had always been about the story that they needed someone to blame, someone to bury. "You try to come in here," Elijah said, "and someone's gonna bleed." Darby spat. "You'd die for her?" "No," Elijah said, "but I'll kill for her." And with that, he shut the door. The first shot came an hour later, a warning, fired into the side of the stable. Elijah didn't return fire, not yet. He watched from the loft window, counting shadows. They were circling, slow, uncertain, a real shootout. That wasn't what they wanted. Not really. They wanted surrender. They wanted her handed over. They wanted to prove that no matter how many men climbed down into the pit, none could change the end of the story. But Elijah had already changed it. And when the second shot came, closer this time, aimed high into the rafters, he fired back. One shot, clean and fast, punched into the dirt at Pike's horse's feet. The beast reared, nearly throwing its rider. The town paused, a breath, then shouting, then hooves again. Elijah turned to Nasha. "If they breach the door, there's a ladder behind the tack room, leads to the arroyo. Ride my horse. He'll take you south. Don't look back." "I won't run," she said. "You'll live." But before the final charge could come, before bullets split the wind, something happened that neither of them could have predicted. A voice rose. It wasn't Elijah's. It wasn't the sheriff's. It was the stable boy, the same one who'd stepped aside days ago. He stepped out from behind the well with a shotgun too big for his frame and shouted loud enough for the whole town to hear. "She didn't do nothing. I saw her. The day she got dragged out of town, I saw them take her. She didn't resist, didn't fight, just stared at 'em like they was ghosts. She ain't guilty, and this ain't justice. This is murder." Silence followed, long and heavy, and into that silence stepped something else. Doubt. Then came another voice, the old preacher, then a ranch hand. One by one, words rose like sparks against a gathering storm. Elijah lowered his rifle. The mob scattered like leaves in wind. No blood spilled that day, but in the dust of the town's main street, something far older had been buried, and something far braver had been born. Truth. Section 7. They never found him again. 200 words. Elijah Cormack never returned to the town. Some said he rode south into Mexico. Others claimed he vanished into the high desert, chasing ghosts or redemption. But those who knew better, those who had seen the way he looked at the Apache girl in the firelight, understood he had found something far stronger than escape. He had found home. Nasha was seen once, seasons later, at a trading post near the Rio Puerco. She carried herself like stone, shaped by time, quiet, resolute, untouchable. The man beside her wore no badge, no spurs, no name on his tongue. But his eyes watched the horizon like a man who had learned what it meant to lose someone, and then be given a second chance. No one ever dug another pit. No one dared. And in the canyons, where the wind sang through the bones of the land, the story was whispered of a girl left to die, and the man who climbed down, not to save her, but to become something more than himself. He never came back up alone, because some climbs aren't escapes, they're resurrections. They left at dawn, just as the sky turned the color of raw copper and the stars faded like old regrets. Elijah saddled the Mustang in silence, his movements slow, deliberate. Nasha stood beside him now, no longer wrapped in fever but in strength. Thin, yes, and pale, from days of pain, but upright, steady, her eyes sharp again. She wore a woven shawl the stable boy's mother had offered in silence, as if to say what words couldn't. They rode without speaking for miles, the town shrinking behind them like a memory finally let go. Neither looked back. What needed to be buried had already been left in the dust. By midday, they reached the red mesas, rising like temples from the earth. Here, the wind carried a different sound, not angry, not bitter, but reverent, sacred. Nasha leaned forward, touched the land with her gaze, and breathed deep. "This is where I was born," she said softly. Elijah nodded. He didn't ask why she had returned. He already knew. They made camp beneath a tall bluff, carved by wind and time. She gathered sage and flint. He fetched water from a spring hidden in a narrow cleft of stone. When the fire crackled to life, it wasn't just warmth, it was ceremony. As the sky darkened, she began to sing. It was not for him, it was for the land, for her ancestors, for the pit that tried to claim her, and the man who climbed down to defy it. He listened anyway, hands still, eyes on the stars. When she finished, she turned to him, not as a girl needing rescue, but as a woman who had survived. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I did," he answered. And in the hush that followed, something passed between them. Not love yet, but the beginning of it. Like fire, like breath, like a heartbeat that had never stopped. Elijah Cormack never returned to the town. Some said he rode south into Mexico. Others claimed he vanished into the high desert, chasing ghosts or redemption. But those who knew better, those who had seen the way he looked at the Apache girl in the firelight, understood he had found something far stronger than escape. He had found home. Nasha was seen once, seasons later, at a trading post near the Rio Puerco. She carried herself like stone shaped by time, quiet, resolute, untouchable. The man beside her wore no badge, no spurs, no name on his tongue. But his eyes watched the horizon like a man who had learned what it meant to lose someone and then be given a second chance. No one ever dug another pit. No one dared. And in the canyons where the wind sang through the bones of the land, the story was whispered of a girl left to die and the man who climbed down, not to save her, but to become something more than himself. He never came back up alone, because some climbs aren't escapes. There are resurrections. And so the canyon that once swallowed the forgotten became sacred ground, where love, not death, was the last word spoken. Subscribe for more true Western stories that should never be forgotten.